The African American Legends highlights the accomplishments of blacks in various politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is the well-known author, Walter Dean Myers. Welcome to African American Legends.
Right, thank you, Dr. Brown.
I like to talk to writers because writers have a great insight into the society. And I also want to know, how did writers start writing? How did you start writing?
I began writing in school in Harlem.
Which school?
PS 125.
Oh, 125.
Yeah, 125, and I loved that school. And in the fourth grade, I remember writing a poem, and it was put into the school magazine. And I was so proud of that and so happy with it. In school, I was not a good student. I mean, my grades were okay, but I got into fights. I couldn't keep still. I guess I would be called hyperactive today. And the only thing I was praised for occasionally was the writing. I liked writing. Later on, when I went to Stuyvesant High School, and
now for the audience, Stuyvesant High School is one of the elite high schools for very smart people. So you were very smart.
No. But then my family sort of broke up. My family broke up. I was living with a foster family. The Dean family raised me because originally I was born in West Virginia, and my parents died when I was a baby. So I was raised by this foster family, and they began to have troubles. And so I joined the Army at 17, and got out a few years later. And at that point, I had no skills. I was fairly bright, but I had no skills. I loved reading. And I remembered a teacher saying to me before I dropped out, she sort of sensed I was going to leave. And she said, whatever you do, continue writing. So I began writing again. I was working in construction. They call it destruction. I was tearing down buildings during the day. And I began writing for magazines like Alfred Hitchcock magazine, and sports magazines. I was into sports. I played basketball, played any kind of sport. And I like sports. So I wrote about sports. And then I sort of drifted away again because there weren't that many opportunities for black writers. There was the Negro Digest, and that published some fiction. And then along came Black Creations. And Fred Beaufort. By that time, I was living down on the Lower East Side, and I knew Fred from just hanging out in the neighborhood. And Fred said, "Why don't you submit a short story for Black Creation?" And I said, "Sure." And I did a short story. And then when that story was published, it was such a thrill for me. There I am in print, and so every time I would see Fred, I'd say, "Fred, I got another story, man." He got tired of seeing me, but he sometimes needed stories. So then I began, I published with Black Creation, Negro Digest, one or two magazines that were college quarterlies. And that made me feel good about myself. I felt that, okay, maybe my day job wasn't that good, but I'm also a writer. I'm something else. And I wrote primarily in two distinct styles. I wrote emulating the British writers, because that's what I had learned in school. And then with Negro Digest and Black Creation, I was writing more from my heart, because I thought these people will allow me to do that. Then I met a couple of guys. I met John Killens. And
John Oliver Killens.
John Oliver Killens. And John, at that point, had a writer's workshop up in Columbia. And he took me on. And I was one of the few people who did not have who didn't have a college background. But I also met James Baldwin. And Baldwin, I told Baldwin that I had started writing as a sort of like a British copier. And he said that he had been through the same experience. And that sort of inspired me, you know. And I love writing. Eventually, I began writing for young people. And I think because my own childhood was so troubled, once I reached 14 or 15, so I was a bright kid who wasn't doing well. You know, a bright kid in the good schools, not doing well. And once I started, man, that's it, you know.
Now, what was the first book that you actually published?
I did a picture book, because I saw a contest for African American writers, but the contest was printed, and the announcement was printed in a magazine that I said, black people don't read this magazine, so I've got a shot. You know? Mm-hmm. So I entered the contest and I won. It was a picture book that was published by Parents Magazine Press, and that was my first book. After that, I met a man named, I think it's Sam Allen, who was a math teacher, who was trying to put together a book of short stories for teenagers. And he asked me to do a short story. Then his funding fell through, but I sent a short story to a publisher, and they bought that. Then I discovered that I had certain assets. I had some ability to write, but I had a large capacity for work.
And you also had a large capacity to see. You could see the broader spectrum of what you were dealing with.
I could see to an extent, but I was learning, and what I learned so much was not to see, but to shut up and listen. Mm-hmm. Because what I was discovering is that there were people all around me who had things to teach me, and things that I had not learned in school. I was learning things from the people, from John Killens, from Baldwin. I learned that some of the people who went to my church had good reputations that I didn't know about, you know, and they didn't brag about those reputations. They were never in the newspapers. I remember as a child, you know, on Mondays was Bible study night. And sometimes they wouldn't have Bible study because some guy who was a writer in the neighborhood would come and and sell his books out of a suitcase. So I said, well, first place, I don't know who Langston Hughes is, and I don't care who Langston Hughes is, but he's messing up my Monday nights. Reverend James Robinson was the minister there.
Church of the Master.
Church of the Master, you know, which they've just torn down about a year ago. It broke my heart. But I began to learn that there were people in that neighborhood who had accomplished things that I didn't know about. And that really impressed me. It took me out of an attitude that if a black person did something, they were unique. Mm-hmm. You know?
Now that's interesting, because today in 2010, you have literally hundreds of thousands of young African Americans, whites, Asians, who really don't understand the atmosphere that you grew up with, that I grew up with, during the days of segregation and early integration, where the black community was an integral part, largely because we lived close to each other because we couldn't live anywhere else.
Couldn't live anywhere.
Now we are dispersed all over, and because of the schools being diverse, and because of many of the teachers not being committed to perpetuating African American history and heritage, many of our young people, you might even say most of our young people, don't know the heritage that you're talking about. They know about Michael Jackson, and they know about Michael Jordan, and they know about Mos Def, but they don't understand how they got to be where they are. So one of the things I was wondering, when you write, do you write with a message in the back of your mind, or do you let the message lead you to where you have to go?
I think it's a combination. It's a combination, and I know what the power. I know the power of history. You know, history is very powerful. I saw a group of guys on 145th Street before they rehabbed that block, and they had broken into a storefront, and were using that storefront to repair bicycles for the neighborhood, and they were making a few dollars, you know, and they seemed like a nice bunch of guys, but they couldn't afford the rent for a regular place. And I took them up a book. I said, I think they'll be interested in this. And I took them up a book, The Story of Major Taylor. Mm-hmm. Major Taylor was an African-American bicycle racer in 1898. And I left those guys with my book, the best reader, reading to the other guys, because I hooked them with a common interest, bicycles. Here was an African-American, and they had never heard of this guy. And there was no way in school that they were ever going to encounter this person. No way. You know, we hear about baseball players, and we don't hear about, okay, now we're hearing about the Negro Leagues, but for years we didn't hear about the Negro Leagues. But I could bring them photographs of the old ball players, the Harlem Wrens, basketball players, the Pioneer Club, the black tennis clubs, and they were shocked. And I tried to explain to them, because we were stuck in this community, because we had to the African Americans in this community, their leaders uplifted the entire community. Mm-hmm. They uplifted the entire community. I mean, they weren't living downtown. They weren't living out in the island. They were living within our community.
And attempting to raise the level of the community, informally, not formally.
Right, informally. And they were. Mm-hmm. They were definitely. So you could live next to somebody who was an opera singer.
That's right, and not know it until they happen to tell you, or you happen to hear them.
And one of the things, there's another factor too, because of the nature of celebrity, we are very sometimes reluctant to say what we can do.
That's our generation. Some of these folks are very clear.
The young, right.
You hear it all over the place. Right. Now, tell us about your most recent book. You've written over 50, 60 books. Tell us about your most recent book.
I began going to the prisons because I'm really interested in what's going on. There's so many young people going through the prison system, and I began to see these children in prisons all over the country. It's shocking. You know, I began to sense that many of these children were as afraid of getting out of prison as they were of being in prison, because they were going back to a disintegrated neighborhood, almost a toxic neighborhood. And so I did a book called Lockdown, in which I talked about one young man's experience in prison and his fears of getting out. And while he's in prison, though, he meets he, he's lucky enough to be on a work program, so he's in jail 4 days a week, and he can work out 3 days. And he meets a person who was an old Dutch man who was in a prisoner of war camp in the Far East. And I had met people like this. I had met some, and how did he survive? And he survived by concentrating on something outside of himself. And these kids have to learn that. And so in relating his experience, the young man that is the hero of the book, Anderson, begins to concentrate on his sister, his younger sister, who's very smart, and she wants to go to Stuyvesant. Again, right.
Autobiographical.
Right. And he decides that he's going to dedicate his life to her, and at that point, he has a purpose in life, and we need this kind of a purpose. We need this kind of purpose. We need the kinds of role models that are essential that these kids are not getting. And so this is basically a book. It's a coming of age story, and at the same time, it's about a young man finding his inner strength.
Now, if someone is watching this and gets excited about this book, how can they get the book?
They can get the book through Amazon.com, Barnes and Nobles. This book would be very widely distributed.
Would this be a good book for a teacher to use in their class?
I think it would be. Several of my books are now mandatory reading throughout the country, and because the books do deal with moral concepts.
And they deal with African Americans.
And they deal with African Americans. Almost all of my books, well, I say I've done 95 books. Mm-hmm. Most of them deal with African Americans, and they deal with Harlem.
Well, the situation of African Americans is really emblematic of the situation of a lot of Americans and a lot of people. Struggle, poverty, luck, ambition, aggressiveness, passiveness, family concerns.
Increasingly. 10 years ago, if you went to the prisons for young people, you would see almost exclusively African Americans and Latino. Now it's more girls in the prisons and girls of all races.
Now, why do you think that is?
Because there's a widening gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. And the people at the bottom they're losing hope. So when people talk about education, education begins, for me, in the community. When a kid comes out of his school, out of his house in the morning, and he comes down and he sees all the young men standing around with nothing to do, that's an integral part of his education. He has to understand why these people are standing around doing nothing. What's happening, he's being told that they are worthless people, that they don't care. And it's not true. It's simply not true. This is his education when he goes to school and he picks up a book and he's not in the book, or when the only thing about him in the book is the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and slavery.
You would think that we went from slavery to the civil rights movement, and that's it.
And the world ended.
And then the world ended.
Now, the United States has more people in prison than any one of the industrialized nations. Two things. Why do you think that happened, and what can we do about it? What should we do about it?
I think that why that happens is that it's the easiest solution. It's the easiest solution. Lock them up. Every politician that in this country that wants to show that they're tough on crime, is lock them up, put them away. We're the only.
And it's a business too. Prisons are a business.
It's a huge business. You have cities competing for the new prison funds. That's the major problem. what we can do about this is to, number one, educate the children. Educate them about who they are, so that they are self-protective. If you don't have a win, you shouldn't be in a fight.
Mm-hmm.
If I mean, for me to see some kid in a prison because someone gave him a look, so somebody, well, he was looking at me all bad. I was saying, whoa, where was your win? How can you win in that sort of thing? They don't understand the consequences of going to jail. Sometimes we're glamorizing that. There's some guy coming on and say, I was shot 5 times, as if that was a wonderful...
And he becomes a rap star.
And he becomes a rap star. And so we need to give these kids the information. The major problem in the African-American community today is a lack of information. The kids don't know what success is. They can, if I go to a school, I've done 95 books. I've been working at home since 1977. But they'll ask me, what kind of a car do you drive?
Yeah.
What kind of a car do you drive? And I tell them, I can't even drive. Mm-hmm. I don't even drive. What kind of a watch do you wear? They don't know how to identify success. And we're not teaching them that. They don't know what it takes to, what work do you need to achieve this success? I was with another runner, Dick Gregory.
Mm-hmm. My buddy, yeah.
And Dick Gregory taught me more about time management in 15 minutes than I had ever. I mean, why isn't this being taught in school? He said that he ran 3 miles a day when he was fasting, and 6 miles a day when he was not fasting. That bowled me over. I said, you do what? But he told me how he managed his time. And I said, I can use that. I can use that time management to learn. I can use that time management to keep in shape. I can use that time management. Young kids are not being taught this kind of stuff.
Now, this is a sobering thought that in our community, the heroes and the sheroes are people in music and sports that are presented to them in the newspaper,
right,
and people who are hustling on the side who present to them in the community. What can folks like you and I and our audience do to help change that?
I think that what we need to do is to present the people who have accomplished from our community in different and more exciting ways. We have to teach. We have to teach the editors, and we have to teach the teachers. We have to teach them that, yes, there were people. Here's something. When I read about the Tuskegee Airmen, people talk about what they did in the war. But you know what shocked me with that? Two things. One, they had a call for people in a nationwide call that thousands of people applied for. They selected some, but the people that they selected then moved on to become leaders in life. They became leaders in life. So these people were not only heroes during the war, but they went on to become community leaders, politicians, statesmen. These people became much more. So what does that tell me? That tells me that from our community, you can reach into our community, touch people, and you're going to be touching gold if you know what to touch.
And communication is the key.
Communication is the key.
Literature is one main means of communication. The media, television, radio, another means of community. But the other means of community is the community itself. Our churches, our community groups, our schools. And when people like yourself write the kind of things that you write and reach out, it touches someone. So hopefully what you've written in lockdown will get people to talking about this excessive incarceration get people to talking about what we can do in our schools to identify. Like some people say, why do you need black history? You answered it. You need black history because most people don't know black history.
Right. And if you don't know history, you don't know who you are. Mm-hmm. This is the point.
That's an interesting point because some people, Caucasian, who come from Europe, say, it didn't matter. I know who I am. But the question I ask about the lower class Caucasians, do they really know who they are?
Very often they don't know who they are. And so what they will do is adopt a persona, whichever is the most popular persona going. But this is what our kids are doing too. You know, they look on television and they see Beyonce, and they see, and she's a lovely woman, and she's, but what they're seeing is subtle differences. I was trying to explain
And the fact is, as we come to the close of our discussion today, they need to read Walter Dean Myers.
Right.
They need to read Lockdown. They need to do the story you're doing about the Ethiopian Air Force and Hubert Julian. Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Walter Dean Myers, author who's done so many wonderful books, particularly aimed at young people. Thanks for being with us today, Walter.
Thanks for having me.